Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Leoncio Montemayor. I'm a project manager at Solarplaza, and I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, A New Era for Solar in Colombia, Non-Technical Risks and Distributed Generation. Our two speakers of the day are Sergio Torres, consultant at IPD Latin America, and Mark Dremel, general manager at Colombian Best. So I think without further ado, we can get started. So this is how the agenda looks like for today. So I'll start with a very brief introduction on Solarplaza and why we're doing this. Then we will go to the presentations, first starting with Sergio on the non-technical risks, and then Mark on the distributed generation. And then we'll be finishing with the Q&A, so make sure to stick around until the end. And just as an announcement, if you have any questions throughout the presentations, please input those questions into the questions box on your control panel to the right of your screen, so that we can have them, we can gather them, and we can ask them in the end. So we are doing this webinar as a prelude to our conference, the Solar Future Colombia, which will take place the 6th and 7th of November in Bogota, where we are aiming to have more than 120 international finance and project development executives, both from the local side and from the international one. We will be learning about the latest updates, such as the auctions, the latest on the subsidies, trends, projections, learnings from the utility scale plants, bifacial modules, and many other topics. We will be using our Solarplaza app, which will make it easier for all of you to, for example, schedule meetings beforehand and have a very productive conference. And in the end, this is the first and only conference dedicated solely to the Colombia's thriving solar sector. Just as a note, I was just reading that UPME approved more than 420 projects. And out of those 420 projects, if I'm not mistaken, like 90% of them were based on solar. So we can really see that solar is really the future for Colombia. For all of you who don't know us, the Solarplaza's mission is to positively impact the world by accelerating the sustainable energy transition. We were established in 2004, and we're based in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Over the last 15 years, we have organized more than 125 events in more than 40 countries worldwide, as you see here on the map. And we have a growing database of 60,000 professionals and counting. So some practical notes. If you have any types of technical issues, please use the chat box. My colleague Marco over here will help you if you have any issues with the audio or video. And as I said before, if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the question box. And we'll cover them in the end. We have a Q&A session at the end, and the slides and recordings will be available afterwards. So I would like to present Sergio Torres, consultant at IPD Latin America. He will start with the non-technical risk in Colombia with his vast experience. So Sergio, if you're ready, we will cede you control of the mouse and the keyboard so that you can control the presentation.
Thank you very much, Leoncio. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar on the thriving future for the solar sector in Colombia. IPD Latin America is a US-based non-technical strategic consultancy firm which was founded in 1999 and has over 10 years of experience working in Colombia's energy sector. We've closely followed the renewable energy developments which have taken place in the country over the last 5 years. And yeah, again, thank you for joining us. Let me start off by talking about the renewables auction, which will take place in October, which will take place this month. and why we think it will set the stage for renewables in the country. We think that it has all the ingredients to be successful, even though it won't change fundamentally the Colombian market structure dominated by a few actors only. Anyways, we think that it has the potential to kick off a unstoppable development of the renewable energy sector in Colombia. First off, uh, as you may know, the February renewables actions largely failed due to the fact that the demand uh, received the conditions with a lot of uncertainties, and there was not enough clarity as to what it would mean for the off-taking side. For that reason, the government took a number of options aimed at promoting the participation of the demand, which we think are going to be quite successful this time. For example, the type of contract was changed to one contract where the demand is going to have certainties as to the amount of energy that is going to receive. The Ministry of Mines and Energy also decided to lower the bar on the qualification criteria from 3 criteria on the first auction. Now we only have to fulfill the fact that no generator can offer more than 40% of the total daily energy. The PPA duration went from 12 years to 15 years. And also the government also sought to promote competition, lowering the size of projects from 10 to 5 megawatts. This time there are going to be about 56 projects in competition, which we think is going to have a positive impact in creating more efficient prices. But the two things that I want to point out here and that serve as a huge incentives for the development of renewables in Colombia is first the obligations that as of 2022 retailing companies are going to have to buy between 8 and 10% of their energy from non-hydro renewable resources. We wanted to make an exercise for illustrative purposes only. The figure on the top right shows the power purchased through long-term contracts, and this is for 2017, both between the regulated and the non-regulated market. Taking out the 8% of the regulated, we see that that year over 67,000 gigawatt hour per year were purchased through long-term contracts. If we take out the 8% of that amount, only in the regulated market, we see that there's a potential for more than 3,000 gigawatt hour per year that will come from non-hydro renewable resources as of 2022, which is the same year when the projects of the action will become operative. The second key issue to keep an eye on is the fact that 6 wind and 2 solar projects have been awarded contracts for the first time in Colombian history in the last firm energy auction, which took place in February. Most likely such plants will also be participating in the October auction with their remaining capacity. Here we see at the figure at the bottom right shows that the 2 solar plants participating in the firm energy auction of October have a remaining capacity of more than 53%. To be able to participate in the next auction. That's around 322 gigawatt hour to participate and to secure long-term contracts. So these two elements pose key incentives and are major indication of the future for renewables in Colombia. Okay. This figure also wants to make the case on why renewables have a significant role in the future of Colombia power system and a key role to fulfill one of the key needs of the system, which is diversification. It shows generation prices by sources between August 2018 and August 2019. It also shows the massive volatility of spot prices early this year, which were likely tied to El Niño and some restrictions in the grid. It shows the structural vulnerability of the Colombian system and the fact that renewables have a key room for action and a key role to offset this situation. The figure doesn't show it, but if you take a look down here, the spot price for September 25 was over 11 cents per kilowatt hour, which means an increase of over 100% in the prices registered month before. Again, that shows how volatile the system is, and this rise in the spot prices are largely due to lower contributions of hydro into the system, again showing how dependent the country is on hydro. The question is, again, here we can see the prices for regulated contracts and unregulated contracts. The question here is whether or not renewable energy prices are going to be able to reach the 6 cents per kilowatt hour in the renewable energy auction. Another thing that will come back later refers to this yellow line here, which shows the diesel generation prices and how expensive they are. This is important because most of electricity generated in Colombia's off-grid areas has diesel as their main resource, which represents huge amount and billions of dollars in terms of subsidies for the central government. We'll come back to that topic later. Okay. The problem here comes to the fact that bold political decisions are needed so the renewable energy sector actually moves along with its potential. A key risk here that we've identified is a political one. It shows that despite efforts of the Iván Duque's administration to consolidate government majorities in Congress, it has been totally unable. As you may see with the bottom left pies there, the government still does not have simple majorities in Congress, which has prevented them from making decisions and from pushing for more aggressive initiatives. The bottom right figure shows how little successful Duque has been in his relations with Congress during his first year in office. There is a very small amount of initiatives which have been presented or approved, and this is quite odd for a president during his first year, when usually relations between the government and the Congress are at the best, are at the highest point. And with regional elections taking place this month, at the end of this month, just less than a week after the auction, we see that it's going to be hard that the government is willing to step on the toes of powerful vested interests of traditional economic sectors. This takes us to our next slide, which divides both the locations of the 8 plants that won in the firm energy auction and the projects that Leoncio mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. Some of them, which add up to over 7.3 gigawatts of installed capacity, which have been approved by the UBME as of September. Again, as Leoncio said, they are mostly solar. Yeah, Leoncio, you were right. It's around 90% of the projects basically being developed throughout the country. The map also shows that basically 2 strategies are being played by players at the moment. The first one refers to projects such as those taking place in Santander and Meta, which are tied to very specific market opportunities. In the case of Santander, for example, there's this 700 megawatt solar plant which has been approved by the UBME, which will likely be linked to, will have Ecopetrol, Colombia's petroleum company, as the main off-taker. The case of Meta, where solar plants are also going to be the power resource for oil activities, basically the same case. The second strategy here, it shows that the other kind of projects which are located far away from consumption centers, mainly those in La Guajira, which are strongly dependent upon the development of transmission lines with the cost that imply. The question here is how regulation will evolve in order to allow these projects to access big consumption centers and become baseload power. We strongly believe that this is a key conditions for renewable to take off in the country by hitting these sweet spots. On the bar below to the left, we show that places like Bogota, down here, the blue here, the center region, which encompasses Bogota, composes more than a quarter of the total demand here. The second largest city, Medellin, in the Antioquia region, also is huge. The Caribbean region, perhaps the only one which is located close to the renewable energy hotspots, with Barranquilla being a key hub given their conditions of active industry, huge solar potential, and little reliability of the electric system. These maps, going along with the political risks that we've identified, are related to the elections that are coming this month, regional elections on the 27th of October. The map is willing to overlap how and to highlight the fact that the Caribbean region is the one with the highest potential in terms of renewables in the country. Is the region where the largest amount of megawatts are going to be developed in the future, where the renewable energy projects which won in the firm energy auction are located. But it's at the same time the place where the left has a stronger force in the country. In no other region, the left has been so competitive against the most traditional and establishment political forces in the country. Two things here are relevant. The first is the very fast rise of the left as a real political force in the country over the last 2 years. The other one is the significant strength that the left has in the region's capitals, particularly Barranquilla, which is Colombia's third largest urban center and, fourth largest urban center. It's one of the most important ports and also one of the most important industrial centers in the country. You also have Cartagena and you also have Riohacha, which are places where solar developments are taking place. The risks that we identify here are related basically to the populistic position that the left has usually held, particularly toward foreign investment, and also to the uncertainties linked to what the political scenarios can be as of the October elections, what this means, who the new stakeholders will be, and what their main political interests and drivers will be. I think that this is something to keep an eye on, particularly to those interested in developing projects in those regions. And these political risks take us to the last set of non-technical risks that I want to talk about in this presentation. Let's start with corruption. Unfortunately, the Caribbean region is known for being one of the places most affected by corruption in the country. According to different studies, the Caribbean coast, and particularly the departments of Atlántico and La Guajira, which are going to be the two hot spots for renewables, likely, both in terms of generation and consumption, rank as one of the most corrupt in Colombia. According to a study done by Colombia's Manufacturing Association, a significant amount of private companies claim to have been approached by public servants willing to help them with permits, to help them with other bureaucratic procedures or requirements, or to accelerate those procedures in exchange for money. Companies have to be very cautious of these kind of practices, which may in turn entail uh, undesired consequences, legal and reputational. Uh, then we move. This corruption has also caused issues such as massive poverty in La Guajira, where both local and national governments have been unable to turn revenues from the extractive industry into better living conditions for local populations. La Guajira is Colombia's first coal producing region and the second gas producing region, but nevertheless is ranked as the second poorest department in the country, which in turn means that the weakness of the central government there is huge. Uh, Historically, local communities which have received little services from the central governments tend to resort to the private sector to ask for services such as education, health, or infrastructure, which in turn which has brought not only in this region but throughout the country, and according to our experience in the energy sector, has brought a number of conflicts between the private sector and local communities, which in turn have resulted in blockades, sabotage, and so on and so forth. But the social element here, and particularly with the fact that the collectora transmission line is going to have to deal with a lot of these issues, is going to have an impact on it might have an impact on future developments. Tied to this, La Guajira is the department with the largest number of indigenous communities in Colombia, which in turn can pose a number of risks in terms of prior consultancy processes or local consultation processes. Sometimes prior consultation in Colombia has become a tool where minority communities kind of make just absurd demands on the private sector just in exchange to provide or to accept these to provide these prior consultations so that projects can be developed. So that's another thing where the eyes must be put. This takes us to a history of strained relationships between local communities in the coast and the private sector, particularly the extractive one, again tied to the incapacity of the government to use revenues to improve living conditions of local communities. We also have identified a risk tied to permits and regulation. Regulation in Colombia continues to be extremely complicated. And whereas the CREG and regulatory agencies are trying to make it more streamlined, there are still issues tied to kind of obscure regulations in the country, as well as we have doubts as to the institutional capacity of regulating, of licensing institutions such as the ANLA to move along with permits at an accelerated pace. And finally, we cannot forget the fact that some FARC former combatants have announced their return to arms, which may have an impact on the sector. La Guajira has historically been, and particularly La Guajira has historically been a place where the FARC has had an intense activity, has been active. Its geographical location along the border with Venezuela, where guerrilla groups are known to have presence, may also represent certain kind of political, of non-technical risk for the renewable projects taking place in La Guajira. And the sector is not immune to this fact. Okay, so just to finish here, I wanted to highlight the facts that would make Colombia's path for renewables a successful one. And basically, the first one is related to the government being able to level the playing field for all players, which again has to be done via political will and perhaps impact some of the vested interests of most traditional generators in the country. The second element of which is modernized regulatory framework according to a modern electric market where all the players involved have an active participation. The CREG is working on that and will continue to follow closely how these regulatory developments evolve. On the off-grid sector, which also represents or should represent a key opportunity for the development of renewables, we see that incentives by the central government are key, but also political will to break up vested interests. We saw on the graph on generation prices how high diesel generation prices are, and basically this is tied to the vested interest of local actors, which basically have diesel as their main business. Also, we see that the government needs to show more political will and more determination in order to push solutions such as distributed generation, which will be key in order to avoid risks of extending transmission lines and bringing electricity service into off-grid areas. And finally, another thing that we think is strongly needed is the need to develop strategies to stimulate future demand, and such as on this front, the government has advanced, for example, on the regulation on electric mobility, and they executed some incentives last month. And there's also a push to bring more electricity into the industrial sector. The problem here, again, is that Colombia is not an industrial economy. The industrial sector is underdeveloped, and now the administration is focused on the so-called orange economy, which unfortunately is not as intensive in electricity demand as one would expect. That would be all on my side. I'm gonna thank you very much, everyone. I'm gonna pass along to Mark to talk about distributed generation.
Thank you, Sergio, for a great presentation. A lot of interesting technical risks that we can discuss later on. I see already some questions from the audience, and another reminder for the people to put in your questions in the question box so we can ask them to Sergio in the end. And yeah, I mean, I saw that you did mention distributed generation as part of of a successful future. And I think with that, it's a nice bridge to introduce to Mark Tremmel, General Manager at Colombian Invest, and he will be speaking exactly about the distributed generation and the status in Colombia. So, Mark, we will cede you control and mouse. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thanks a lot. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Depends on the region where you are. Pleasure to talk to you today. Do I have? Yeah, I got control right now. Good. So a couple of words about myself. I'm now in the PV industry since 2005. Resident in Colombia and Bogota since 2013. Besides being an EPC for Colombian Invest, I'm also doing some teachers stuff, basically some teaching of ERP, where I'm a professor for the renewable energy. So you see a couple of projects that we've been doing already. This year we've been doing smaller projects, for example, the WWF Bogota with 11.9 kilowatts. We've also been doing a project with Heineken, 70.4 kilowatt peak, and some other projects. Last year we've been doing a project with 31 kilowatts and so on. So there's pretty good experience not only on a theoretical side, but also on the practical side of what we call distributed generation. And first of all, I mean, if we talk about the DG market in Colombia, well, the first thing that I would say is distributed generation for us is everything up to 1 megawatt. Basically, when you see residential systems of typical sizes of 3, 4, 5, maximum 10 kilowatts, then you see commercial systems up to 100K. And then you see industrial systems, bigger sizes, but the maximum size that we've been seeing on the market more commonly would be 1 megawatt. Around 30 megawatts of distributed generation plants are so far built. Around that, it's very, very hard to, let's say, to figure out that number because we don't have a solar association yet. And therefore, it's really hard to tell you whether it's going to be 20, whether it's going to be 40, whether it's going to be 30, whether it could be 15 megawatts. But from what we believe, from what we've seen on the market, it should be, well, up to now, it should be around 10 megawatts additional to what's last year being built. So it should be around 30 megawatts. Around, well, what I call around, let's say what people are talking in the market, what people are developing, what people are eager to do, there should be around 100 megawatts in total. It's not very clear whether this is going to happen now, whether it's going to happen in 2020, whether it's going to happen in 2021. But there's certainly a good potential on especially industrial plants that are coming up, that are popping up, and there will be a real good market on DG. So if you see on the major regions, as you already mentioned that, and I think there the distributed generation is really, really important because, I mean, you can build your solar plant right next to your factory or at the factory or on the rooftop of the factory, while the huge power plant generation, you typically look for the sweet spot. So you have really, really good irrigation, but probably not very, very close your consumption. So I think the major part of the DG is really that you can use it right at the spot, and that really makes it very, very interesting, especially because you also have some other advantages. So very, very important regulation that is right now already in place is the CREC 030. The CREC is the regulation authority for the energy and gas sector. So we have that one in place since March 2018, which is already now a year and a half. And it's basically a really good net billing up to 100K, where you get not exactly the wholesale price, but you get the wholesale price minus the C part, the commercialization part, which in most cases are like 45, 50 pesos. So you get at least around 80, 85, 90% of the energy price back if you make injection to the grid on the weekends, which is good. Really helps a lot. There are some limitations on that, especially if you generate more than what you right now consume. Saying that, for instance, if you consume 10,000 kilowatt hours a month, and tomorrow you're gonna inject 15,000 in addition to what you do with your self-consumption, then there will be some part that you only get the generation price back, and the other part you will get the wholesale price minus the commercialization price. So there are some limitations on that. Sometimes not easy to understand. If you go above 100K, then you only get the generation price, which is something very, very unfortunate, because mainly the industry, mainly the bigger commercial rooftops are then limited to those 100K projects, which is something that we need to look into that. Well, that's my suggestion, that the government should look into that. And above 1 megawatt, you get kind of the same rules as the 100K projects and above, but it's much harder to get the project re-registered because you need hourly measurement on site. You got some grid connection rules that are pretty intense. So basically, the whole regulation goes into maximum 1 megawatt. On the same side, you have the correct 015, and the 015 basically says everything up to 100K, you have no obligation for any backup contract. But above that, you have an obligation to sign a backup contract with a grid operator. Pricing is depending on a lot of local factors. So I've seen cases where the backup contract was almost 0 pesos, which is excellent. But I've also seen cases where it can also be, let's say, up to 10%, which is not exactly what's supposed to be, because I mean, if you do a saturation and then you have the obligation to pay almost 10% of the price back only as a backup contract, that's, let's say, not pretty good for the financial situation of the project. Then on the next side, you have some grid operator regulations that came together with the CREG 030. I think one of the most important restrictions that you have, that if you're using small transformers, or if you're using, let's say, the local low voltage grid for injection, then you can only use, well, in theory, you can only use 15% of the capacity of the transformer, which gives a lot of limitations to that. So, for instance, you have a customer consuming 20,000 kilowatt hours. You say, okay, let's do a 50 kilowatt project. With a 50 kilowatt project, meaning that if you use that grid for the surplus energy to feed in, according to the CREG 030, then you have to have a transformer of at least around 400 kilowatts, 400 kVA, to make that usage of that. Otherwise, you will have a problem. And most of the times, what you see in practice, you see that they might have a substation of 200 kVA, but then you can only use the 50% of the 200 kVA transformer, meaning that you can only use you can only build a 30 kilowatt project, which makes things a lot more complicated. On the national development plan side, which is something that thanks to Duque came into the place, we now got, since June this year, we got a VAT exemption on solar panels, charge regulators, and inverters. That really helps a lot. That means really nowadays you can bring in solar panels without even doing anything. You just bring them in, you don't pay any VAT. The same on inverters and charge regulators. Unfortunately, not on the rest of the BOS or racking or cables or so on. Only on solar panels, charge regulators, and inverters. You also gives us a lot of benefit on the administrational side, because before that we have a law 1715 that gives you basically 4 benefits. Out of those benefits, the most important one is that you can use up to 50% of the investment. You can use that against the income tax declaration. But for that, you need to do, or you needed to do, 2 very important measures One was to get the approval of the UPME. The UPME is the planification of the Ministry of Mines and Energy. And once you got the technical review and the technical case from the UPME, then you need to go to ANLA. ANLA is the National Authority for the Environmental Licensing. And ANLA took you 4 to 6 months to get that approval. In the later stages, you even had to pay for that. And once you got that approval, then the customer could use the real income tax benefit, which was just too complicated. It was too much of a hassle, a long process. And now at least it is only with UPME. It's supposedly to be 45 days. Well, in our experience, we've done a project, handed it over in August to UPME. Today is the 1st of October, so the 45 days are already over, and we have not even heard anything back so far. So our experience is probably that they are very, very occupied with what is the auction, the second version of the auction. So this is really, really complicated. Some major players on the market, you see for sure the utilities, you see Coenza, which is part of the Enel group, you see EPM, Empresas Públicas de Medellín. Those are very, very big players. Then you got Celsia. Celsia is part of the Argos group, so they do concrete, but they also have, I think Celsia would say is probably the most advanced in renewables because they are really, really focused on renewables, on solar. They've done a lot of rooftops. Then you see some international EPC companies, for example, as Panasonic. But Panasonic this year, they took the decision to go out of business in Colombia, so they are no longer doing any EPC work anymore. Maybe one of the reasons what we suggest, what we suspect, we suspect is that probably they were expecting a lot more growth on the market, and they just did not get the critical mass to sustain the business in Colombia. We see a lot of Green Yellow. Green Yellow is a French developer, and Green Yellow, but they do a lot of business also in Brazil. They are part of the Éxito group, so a supermarket group, and they do a lot of rooftop business, 400K, 500K, up to 1 megawatt I've seen. Some of the projects that we've seen in the market, we see Compañía Nacional de Chocolates has to sell the project, 2.2 megawatts, already installed like for 2 years almost. We see Tecnoglass, a 4 megawatt project, rooftop project in Barranquilla. The good thing is that all of those projects are really working. The bad thing, for example, in the instance for Tecnoglass, is that all of the neighboring companies and all of the neighboring industries, they really were eager to do another project there, solar project, self-consumption, and unfortunately, the grid operator denied that because Tecnoglass took almost 100% of the capacity of the grid from there. So we see there are some infrastructure problems as well. We see a very nice rooftop project in Cartagena. That's the convention center there, also sells a project. We see the CIAP, that's the 1 megawatt project. And we see some others, various rooftops, 0.5 megawatts. They just made a rooftop of 1 megawatt in Barranquilla as well. What I would like to point out in my last 2 or 3 minutes is the following. I've just been to Brazil, I've just been to the Intersolar in South America, and we always ask ourselves in the last couple of weeks and months is what is missing in Colombia that we could do almost like the same type of business as in Brazil. What you see here is a graph that shows in Brazil like the huge amount of growth, especially when you see 2017 to 2018, but even up to 2019. This graph is only showing up to April 2019. And it is really, really amazing that you see a lot of residential and commercial projects there. So this is something that I really learned, that people are doing residential and commercial projects there, or even industrial projects we see. And this is something that we've always asked ourselves, what is the major difference between these two markets? Only on the distributed generation side. I'm not talking about tenders. I'm not talking about huge projects of 5 megawatts, of 10 megawatts, of 20 megawatts. I'm only talking about rooftop business of either the small scale, like 5K, 7K, 10K projects, but on a important amount of numbers, not one project a month. Maybe better would be 100 projects a month or 1,000 projects a month, because Colombia still has almost 50 million people, and it should still be on a DG side, one of the very important markets. But what do we see? We see that there is really no quick solar installation on the residential and commercial sector, because once you install that, then you start doing administration, then you start doing a lot of things that you're not supposed to do. I'm going into that in a couple of seconds. Second is that we still don't have very competitive pricing if we see, let's say, the major goods, what in Brazil they sell as a kit, the panels, the inverters, and the racking. We still don't have that. Then the next thing is, which is very annoying. I mean, you've seen the Craig 030 and it really looks very promising, but unfortunately, the reality is different. The reality shows that now projects that are built, projects that are operative, projects that finally feed in the energy, the operator, the grid operator just does not do what he's supposed to do by the 030, but it's just paying almost half of it, which is very, very annoying, because then the end customer is saying, yeah, but you promised me, you told me, and it's not going to happen, which is very bad and slows also the market. You see a lot of over-regulation from my point of view, and I think one of the very most important point is that one. You don't see the installers doing installations, you see the installers doing paperwork. We still have an administrational work to do that is not easy to do, that takes time and is subject to interpretation. Further challenges, and going into that, there is one very, very important point on that, is the RETIE, that is the electrical code for Colombia, is the version of 2013. Now we are almost getting to 2020, and we still don't have a recent version. So one of the key elements that you need, that the grid operator accepts the installation from a technical side, is that you need the RETIE certificate. For that, you need an inspector. And most of the inspectors I've personally met, they don't really have a clue about solar. They say, yeah, well, very nice. What type of cable did you use? Does this have the RETIE certificate, and so on? But most of the certificators, they really don't know what they need to look at. And that gives them some interpretation freedom, which unfortunately most of the time just does not make things very quickly. And this is something that we need to, let's say, we as a market, we as a group, we as an industry, we need to push forward. We need to hopefully get to what the installer can do, what the EPC can do, is doing the engineering, getting the purchase in, doing the installation, doing the commissioning, and then maybe whatever, a week of paperwork, and then you're done, and you get to the next work. And this is something that I really hear a lot from the market, that there are still a lot of issues. For sure, Colombia is a really, really good marketplace for solar. There is a lot of place in the market yet. We have energy prices that are high, maybe not as high as Central America, but they're still very, very high in comparison to what you can do with solar. So there is a good moment, let's say, to enter. We see that the industrials are really just waking up. They're picking up speed, and they really want to go forward with some solar projects. And I think this, as a wrap up from my side, I think really important is to see there's a potential there. Maybe we still are at the bottom of the curve of what you've just seen, what happened in Brazil. But I really believe, and I think everybody is just waiting, when is the right moment that the market really explodes. And probably from what we see with the VAT exemption, the residential market is just really picking up quite some good speed. So hopefully we can get those administrational things solved, so that the installer at the end of the day can do what they can do. They can install. Thank you a lot from my side. Hopefully we get a lot of good questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for the presentation. I think it was quite interesting to compare or contrast both presentations. Sergio Torres talking more on the grand scale, like the large scale auctions, and you pinning down and zooming into distributed generation. I think that was quite fascinating. So I think we can get started with the Q&A. There are a couple of questions here from the audience, and again, I remind everyone, please send in your questions for the Q&A. So one question for Sergio. Of course, you were talking as the Guajira is one of the renewable energy hotspots for Colombia. Yeah, one of the key issues here, of course, is the interconnection from Guajira to the demand centers. So how does this play out in a political landscape? The project of interconnecting La Guajira to the demand centers.
Yeah, I mean the government has an intention of developing the transmission lines in order to bring power from La Guajira projects into the center. Again, the issue here becomes one once again. If you see, for example, the political landscape in the departments that are going to be part of the transmission lines, there you may see what kind of political challenges may emerge in terms of local politicians, new stakeholders on the map, and what their interests, what their demands may be in order for this project to be developed. And once again, the problems or the issues tied to social developments in these regions are going to be key and need to be taken into account. The relationship between minority communities, particularly up in La Guajira, and the private sector has not been an easy one. I mean, they have a long history of working with the extractive sector, particularly with coal, and they kind of tend to relate foreign investment along with their history and their relationship with the coal industry as well. So that's something that definitely needs to be considered when you think about this.
Okay. Thanks for your answer. And definitely, something to keep in mind in the next elections. I think this is a question that can go to both. We saw that Bogota or the center is quite a hotspot for both distributed generation and larger scale projects. Why is this the case? Is it because it's closer to a demand center? Of course, in Bogota you don't have, for example, the same irradiation as in the Caribbean coast. So why is it that most of the projects are based in Bogota? Maybe Sergio, you can start, and then Mark can continue.
Yeah, as I showed in my previous map, I think that consumption and demand is the key issue driving
Hmm.
developments in Bogota. You have the most active, it's basically the largest industrial center in the country.
Mm.
It's also the most populated area with over 7-8 million people.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that those two elements make it a big hotspot for developments. I don't know, Mark, what you think?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I would say pretty much the same thing. I mean, you have a lot of industry around Bogota. For example, you have the biggest milk maker, the biggest milk factories around there, Alpina, for instance, and you see a lot of industry around Bogota that all have really like a lot of consumption. So it just makes sense, let's say, to use that on a distributed generation side and say, yeah, why don't we make a solar project there? Because most of the times you also got the space. And I think this is really one of the very important topics to say. And also, what I would like to point out, Bogota is not that bad. I mean, right now, currently, even so, I'm on a very short stay in Germany only this week. But if you see, let's say, Europe and you see Germany, and I've seen a lot of solar panels around here in the very northern part, very close to the Netherlands,
Hmm.
and we don't even have sun. I haven't seen the sun the last 2 days. So there are very few irradiation there, and even in Germany, there's still stable conditions for solar. And in Bogota, you have at least 1350, almost 1400 hours of kilowatt hours per kilowatt peak generated per year, which is actually a good value. It's not Barranquilla, it's not the coastal area for sure, but it's also not that bad because you got the cold weather that really helps a lot for solar irradiation and for solar to work.
Yeah, I agree, and I can imagine, Mark, you already have quite some experience in Germany as well with distributed generation. Um, yeah, how does it translate to Colombia? I mean, you were mentioning some of the sort of the key missing factors for Colombia. I mean, from your experience in Germany, how can you translate that to Colombia?
Well, I think one of the most important points, and I mean, Tariq, you can probably very much underline that we have a lot of administration in
Mm,
Colombia that just makes things a lot more complicated. We have a lot of laws, we have a lot of regulations changes pretty quickly without previous notice.
mhm.
They pretend to get easier, but unfortunately they don't, or it's just not even very much understandable sometimes. What would be the next step to do? Because they say, yeah, well, last month this was the procedure, but now we are about to change that. But we would like to have everything on an online platform, but just the online platform is not ready yet, and we don't know whether it can be ready yet now or maybe next week or so. And maybe one of the key things that I would really like to point out is if we had a much better administration,
Mhm.
um, things would be much easier. Something like online platforms, we just put everything there. You just click submit, and then the next day you get the approval, or you just get the remarks. So that would really help us a lot.
Yeah. Okay, I see. Perfect. Well, we're running a little bit short on time, so I think we do have a couple of questions, but I think to finish off, yeah, maybe let's round up with a nice visionary question, both of you. Sergio, so yeah, what is your prediction on the auctions for, well, in what, 21 days from now?
Yeah, again, I think the elements are given. There are huge incentives for the auction to be successful. I think that, as I mentioned, the two key incentives are the obligation that the demand is going to have to buy between 8 and 10% of its power from renewables, and second that there are projects with contracts already, eight renewable energy projects which are interested. I mean, they're most likely going to participate in the October 22nd auction, basically because they need to access to long-term contracts
Mhm.
and secure financing.
Okay. Okay, perfect. And Mark, what do you like if we time travel to the future 1 year from now? Yeah, how do you see the distributed generation segment in Colombia, or how do you hope to see the distributed generation segment?
Well, first of all, I'm very happy that you don't ask me for a number because typically they always ask me for a number. How many megawatts do you think we're gonna make this year? And I've always been wrong. I've always been wrong. I've always,
Everyone.
let's say, yeah, I overestimated always that number. And well, I mean, what I would like to see and what I would like to hope is something like that kind of steep um, incremental numbers as we've seen in Brazil. I mean, Brazil this year alone, it's more than 1 gigawatt for distributed generation. It's supposed to be doubling by next year. So, I mean, this would be amazing if we just can make whatever 10% out of that. So,
Yeah.
if we could only do 100 megawatts of distributed generation by end of 2020, this would be already really, really nice. And I mean, there are some of the key players, as I mentioned before, that are going into that direction already. We've seen Green Yellow, for example. They're putting some good numbers out there, but we also really hope that there are further players. Especially there should be enough end customers for that to really get the market growing.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Well, seems like Colombia has the right ingredients. Yes, Sergio?
Leonce, just to add up on my final answer, of course, that is going to highly depend on the fact that the criteria of the auction, the single criteria, is fulfilled, and we also need to wait and see what the demand side is willing to pay. But I think that with 56 projects in competition, that's gonna turn out good for forming efficient prices. And the experience of the first auction, where when the minister said that the prices were very competitive and
Yeah.
lower than expected, at least that sets a positive
Message.
sign.
Yeah,
Mhm,
positive
mhm.
vibe.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think with that, let's hope that in 21 days we can actually see this positive vibe for
Hope so.
both sides, for the supply and the demand side. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Mark, for your presentations. I think they were both very interesting and very insightful. And all the audience members, I would like to thank you for joining us today. Just as a reminder, if you want to continue discussing more of these topics, we'll be hosting the Solar Future Colombia, 6th and 7th of November in Bogota. So make sure to check out the website there on the screen. Thank you all. Thank you again, Mark and Sergio, and hope to
Thank
see
you.
you again in the Solar Future Colombia. Thank you, everyone.
Muted.